There's obviously a lot going on with the economy right now, the markets, policymakers are in here making a lot of decisions that are going to have, that are having important implications and will have implications going forward. But maybe before we get into those things, we wanted to sort of just take a step back with you and talk about a little bit how we got here. So obviously the 2008 financial crisis caused a lot of damage and significant issues with our economy. And it also introduced some changes in how the Federal Reserve responds to shocks and downturns. So when the Fed began its quantitative easing policies during the financial crisis, it seemed like most economists were convinced that would trigger and lead to inflation. But you were actually one of the few people that were sort of saying that it wouldn't. And, you were offering up some explanations why. So I thought maybe to start, you could just give us an overview of actually what quantitative easing is, and then, in your mind, why it actually hasn't been inflationary.
Sure. Yeah. So I kind of went through, in 2007, 2008, I went through the same evolution of thought that probably a lot of people are going through right now, especially younger people who are experiencing something like this for the first time. I was actually running a stock picking event-driven strategy back then. And in about early Q1, Q2, 2008, my strategy completely stopped working. And it was because of all these big macro trends. And I kind of started to realize the more I talked to people and the more I was looking at the macro environment, I felt like if I didn't understand this wave of policy that was coming at the economy, that because it just dominated everything, because it was just so colossal, I felt like these micro strategies that a lot of us were running back then, they just wouldn't work because all the correlations went to one. And no matter what you did, you couldn't fight the Fed and these big trends. And so one of the big things that I was focused on was understanding Federal Reserve policy back then. And I was sort of fortunate in that I had a number of good connections in Japan, mainly at Nomura, and people who had been through the Bank of Japan's iterations of these policies back in the early 2000s. And they kind of walked me through all of the accounting. And, I'm more of an accounting nerd, I guess, than anything else. And so the balance sheets to me were very clean, the way that all of this works. And I kind of got into this mode of thinking from all of this from a first principles perspective, that I need to understand how the machinery works. And if I understand how the machinery works, then I can understand how the flow of funds will work through the economy and impact all of this stuff. And quantitative easing is a fascinating one because a lot of people just assume that this is some sort of naturally inflationary money printing type of policy. And when you actually look at the nuts and bolts of it, it really depends on a whole slew of other factors. And so quantitative easing at its most basic form is the Federal Reserve, which is the Fed's just a big, big bank. They're just the biggest bank in the whole world. They expand their balance sheet. So they create reserves. And what they do is they purchase an asset from either a bank or a non-bank with a bank as the intermediary. And in either case, what they're essentially doing is they are creating what is effectively new money. So when a non-bank, let's say I sell $100 of treasury bonds to a bank who on-sells it to the Federal Reserve, the Fed creates a reserve for the bank and the bank creates a deposit for me. And so what I've effectively done in the private sector is I've offloaded my treasury bond to the Fed through the bank and I've taken on a deposit, okay? And at the private sector level balance sheet, this is just it's a clean asset swap. The way that I like to describe it is it's a lot like taking a savings account and swapping it for a checking account. And so at my balance sheet level, nothing's really changed. My net worth hasn't changed. Actually, my income has gone down because now I hold a lower yielding instrument. And the Fed has taken this treasury bond and they've basically stuffed it in a hole, because this is the big thing I think people miss, is that a lot of the times when balance sheets expand, so for instance, when a corporation expands their balance sheet, let's say to borrow money from the household sector. The corporation is in the private sector, so their balance sheet expands. They have more purchasing power, and I've given money up, but now I have a what is essentially a savings bond of some sort. And so my net worth hasn't decreased or anything. I haven't dissaved money or anything. In theory, I mean, I could go out and borrow more money or just as much money as I could have before. My credit hasn't changed. But what's different about when the Fed does it, the Fed takes it out of the economy. And this is the thing that a lot of people miss with QE is that while they've printed a reserve deposit, they've effectively unprinted the treasury bond. And so all of the dynamics of how that deposit impacts the economy in the long run depend on a whole slew of other factors, like what is the U.S. Treasury doing? Is the U.S. Treasury spending more money? Or, what are the portfolio balancing impacts? That's been one of the big debates over the years is, does this stuff impact stock prices and things like that? Does it impact the bond prices? Because if it's impacting asset values, then theoretically this could be inflationary, not just for asset prices, but for consumer goods as well. So it's easy to simplify this policy and just say, oh, the Fed is printing money, that's going to cause inflation. And it's a lot more complex than that. It's a lot more nuanced than that. But that's kind of the simple overview of what QE does.